this is where our story begins, with Matteo waiting, sitting quietly at the base of a vast, cool wall inside a silent chapel. We don't know why he's there, but we do know that he came alone, and he brought only a few things with him: some paints, brushes, and a cloth. But more than anything else, it seems he brought his ears. He came to this abandoned church to listen. Listen to what exactly? That's what we're going to find out. Before we dive in though, let me tell you about something called Cabaletta. If you love art and storytelling, then you will love Cabaletta. It's a series that takes you through famous artworks and dives into the stories behind them. I'm hosting the series, and you can find it on a streaming service. You can also find tons of other shows about art and artists there too. So in fact, you might have even heard of another channel. They have an awesome show on there, all about drawing. All the episodes are super fun and informative, and there's even a podcast by the creator. So much great content available right now. There's a lot of awesome content that you can binge over the holidays or whenever you have some free time. Now, back to our story. Our artist friend, Matteo, is working on a large fresco, and while we don't know what the finished piece will look like, we do know that it will be an important one for him. This isn't just any chapel. It's the same one that he spent years painting as a young man. His mentor, Maestro Giovanni, told him to return here after 10 years. He said that if Matteo had learned from him, then he would know what to do. Giovanni had passed away before the job was finished, and the wall was left bare. Now, 10 years later, Matteo has returned. We don't know why Matteo was sent away all those years ago. Perhaps he was unready yet, or maybe there was something about his style that did unmesh well with the project. Either way, he's come back older and wiser and ready to finish what he started. But he's taking a different approach now. He doesn't want any gold leaf. No gilding on this trip. He's leaving his assistants behind. No help on this job, Cam. He's not using any drawings or sketches. No planning this time around. He wants to see what happens if he gives himself over completely to the wall. Ko starts his work at the very bottom, tracing lines onto the surface with his fingers, okay? As he moves up, he finds that the wall is still damp in some areas. It's cold marble, but there are parts that feel warm to the touch. What a strange sensation to run your hands over cool stone and find spots that are actually hot. It's unusual, but not unheard of, depending on the climate. Sometimes stone can absorb heat from the sun, even if it's been raining. Sometimes science can make art feel magical. When Matteo first began painting here 10 years prior, the wall was hot. It was summer, but now the weather has changed. Winter, cold, wet, dark, and yet there is warmth here. The wall is alive. So is Matteo. Why did Maestro Giovanni send him away? Was it because he wasn't listening to the wall? Was he supposed to come back when the wall was cold? Does this have something to do with the fact that he's only using earth pigments? It's pigments that come from minerals and plants? Nothing metallic. Was Giovanni trying to teach him something? Something about the wall? Something about making art? Working with earth pigments presents some challenges. They aren't as bright or as easy to use as the metal ones, but they do offer a certain purity, okay? And Matteo is experienced with them, okay? He knows their strengths and weaknesses. These pigments have a direct connection to the earth, okay? They are natural, elemental. Sometimes they crack. Sometimes they fade. Sometimes they hold, and sometimes they fall. Natural pigments have depth, a history, a life force. Metal pigments may shine, but they lack this quality. They're dead. They have no memory. And so, Matteo works, tracing lines, finding shapes. He makes slow marks, little by little, day by day. He listens. The wall speaks to him, tells him where to go, where to stop. He lets the colors flow from his hands. He trusts the wall to guide him. He trusts the process. He feels connected to the earth and the sky, to the plant and the mineral, to the cold and the warm. It's almost as if he's painting blind, relying solely on feeling rather than sight. What we have here is a special kind of connection between artist and wall, between Matteo and the space itself. He is able to tune out everything else. He doesn't need music. He doesn't need to talk. He doesn't even need to think. He just needs to connect. He feels every line, every color. It's meditative. It's calming. It's centering. Each day, when he's done, he folds his cloth and places his tools on the bench. He sits quietly, letting the colors dry. He looks at what he's made. He considers the wall. Sometimes he adds to it. Sometimes he steps back. Sometimes he makes changes. The finished piece will be big. It will cover the entire wall, but we don't know what it will be of. Maybe it'll be a landscape. Maybe it'll be a religious scene. Maybe it'll be abstract. But we do know it will be powerful. It's interesting to consider why our artist chose to paint this wall. Frescoes aren't cheap. They take time and skill. They aren't easy. They're definitely not quick, okay? And they aren't usually done on walls that far up. But perhaps this was a special project. Perhaps the people who hired him wanted a powerful piece. Maybe they wanted something to inspire quiet contemplation. Maybe they wanted a reason for people to visit this place again. Maybe they wanted Matteo to come back. But whatever the reason, he's here and he's listening to the wall. He's tuned out the world outside. No phone, no TV, no stress. He's not worried about money. He's not worried about what anyone else thinks. He's worried about honoring the wall. He's worried about the colors and the shapes. He's worried about creating something meaningful. He's worried about sharing the story of the wall. The old monk comes by every day, unlocks the door, and goes about his business. He doesn't say much. He doesn't have to. Matteo understands. They're both listening. They're both learning. They're both growing. And when Matteo is done, whoever commissioned the work will come to see it. They'll probably have a reaction: surprise, joy, anger, confusion. But Matteo won't care. He'll be ready to move on to the next wall, the next story, the next chance to listen. He never began with a sketch that was far too loud. No one could make this wall sing except him, and he knew the notes already. The lines were too loud. They decided too much, too early. Instead, he dipped his softest brush into a diluted yellow. It's a color so pale it nearly vanished when it dried. It was almost like the wall was keeping its secrets close, whispering them only to the wind. He stood back. What was he doing? Should he just leave? He could always come back tomorrow, make it brighter, bolder. The bristles touched the wall gently, upward, then curved slightly to the left. He exhaled. There, a mark. Only he would notice. Breath and pigment. He stepped back. The chapel remained unchanged. A double unchanged. But something had begun. When he held up the paint can, the yellow glinted back at him. Not the color he wanted to use, but there was something in that shade. A whisper of promise. A secret shared between the two of them. He didn't plan on painting the entire chapel. He never did. He was only here to make an intervention, to break through the dull ache in his chest. The chapel was fine like this, but it needed to remember it was no longer blank. The first stroke was not about color. It was about touch. It was about waking the wall up, kissing it awake. It was about saying, I was here. I am here. This was his meditation, his oxygen. To do this, to be here, even if no one saw it, even if it meant nothing to anyone else, it mattered. It wasn't just white walls. It was light bleeding through stained glass windows, throwing shards of red, blue, and gold onto the worn flagstones below. It was centuries of incense smoke curling through rafters, gathering dust on the worn wood. It was whispers of Latin prayers in the scrape of chairs on stone. It was the heavy velvet of an ancient hymn book lying open on a pew. It was the ghost of a candle flame flickering in the darkness. It was stories etched in stone and whispered in the shadows. He reached for another can of paint. this one holding a deeper, richer hue of the same color. Still too bright, too soon. He thinned it further, adding more water until the pigment matched the parchment skin of his dreams. He dipped his brush into the paint and closed his eyes. Just a little. He traced the line of a window, a sliver of sunlight piercing the gloom. When he opened his eyes, the world shifted. It wasn't a mistake. It was exactly what he wanted. He moved around the chapel, finding light in the shadows, using the paint to breathe life into the silence. His hands danced across the wall, leaving whispers of yellow where the light had fallen. Sometimes he used the paint thinner. Sometimes he used his fingers. Sometimes he let the paint drip down the wall like tears. When he finished, he stood back and looked at the mess he'd made. It was perfect. He remembered why he came here. Not to fix anything, not to improve it, but because he needed to make the wall remember it was no longer blank. The chapel was still there, untouched, but it was changed. He thought of all the people who walked these paths, the pilgrims and the hermits, the lovers and the liars, the lost and the lonely. They'd come here seeking solace, and it had been there for them. Now he was here, too, seeking solace. It wasn't the brightest yellow, but it was enough. It was a reminder of the sun that shone even when the clouds hid its face. He looked at the paint can, empty now, and smiled. He'd done what he came to do. He never painted the entire chapel. That would have been too loud. It would have been a statement. Would have been saying, "Look at me. Look what I can do." He didn't want to do that. He wasn't here to impress anyone, not even himself. He left the chapel as he found it, mostly unchanged, but not quite. He'd given it a touch, a whisper of who he was, of what he felt. He'd left a piece of himself on the wall, and it was enough. Years later, someone found his paintings. They weren't sure how long they'd been there, hidden in plain sight. Maybe they'd always been there, and no one had noticed. Or maybe they'd faded over time, becoming one with the wall. People came from all over to see them. Some saw only childish scribblings. Others saw echoes of the light they felt inside themselves. They saw glimmers of hope in the fading yellow, a testament to the quiet strength of the human spirit. They talked about the artist, trying to figure out who he was, why he'd done it. But no one knew the story behind the yellow paint. Kay didn't know that he'd come here seeking solace, that he'd found it in the silence of the chapel. Kay didn't know that he'd left a piece of himself on the wall, and it was enough. They called his paintings a miracle, a mystery, a masterpiece. They put him on a pedestal and made him a legend. But he was just a man who needed to paint a wall, and if he could do that, so could they, They just needed to find their own chapel, their own place where they could be quiet and still and let their thoughts drift like smoke in the air. They needed to find their own way of making the world remember it was no longer blank. All he asked was that they do it in a color that made them happy. As for him, he found his peace in the fading yellow of a forgotten chapel. It was enough. He stood perfectly still. Matteo, though there was something at the door, had been something, was something. He didn't turn. He didn't ask. He knew who it was. Luca, the boy he had once taught. Now a man. A man with patrons and fame in the studio near the Arno. Painted ceilings for noblemen, altars dressed in gilded frames. But not here. Not in this forgotten room. And yet, Matteo kept working. He mixed ochre with water, making slow circles in a cracked ceramic bowl. He heard the hesitation in Luca's breath, the soft intake of air just beyond the threshold, the door that did not open, the footsteps that did not enter. And then he felt it again, that strange stirring deep inside him. A sudden fluttering like a bird about to take flight, or perhaps an echo of those years when his own heart beat a little faster at the sound of the Master S voice. Luca would return. He always did. But he would never ask why Matteo had chosen this chapel so far from the city, tucked away on a hill overlooking the vineyards below. Why he painted without audience, without commission, without glory. Some questions, even those born of admiration, dissolved in the silence between teacher and student. Okay, and in that silence, there's understanding, a kind of communion that transcends words. Okay, in that silence, Matteo dipped his brush again into the bowl, letting the cool slip between his fingers. The sun slanted through the dusty window, painting stripes of light on the floor. Outside, the wind chimes tinkled in the breeze, but inside, all was quiet, except for the scrape of his brush on dry plaster. Quiet and still, as if the very air were holding its breath. He could hear the pulse of the afternoon, the drowsy murmur of the world outside the chapel walls, the soft drone of a lone bee, the distant clatter of a hammer on stone. All these sounds, normally a source of comfort, of reassurance, were gone, lost in the vastness of the empty space. He wanted to fill it with color. The chapel had been bare when he found it, stripped of all adornment, abandoned, silent. It was a womb of a place, dark and dank, smelling faintly of mildew and dust. And in the stillness, he had begun to paint, driven by some force beyond his understanding, compelled to cover the stark white plaster with images born of sunlight and shadow. It took him weeks to finish. Scared, he worked in the mornings before the heat of the day, taking the ferry across the river, then walking along the dusty road. Sometimes Luca would come with him, but not always. Most days, Matteo walked alone, his paint-stained smock flapping in the wind, his wooden sandals slapping against the par-baked clay. At first, the townspeople stared. They'd see him coming, his face weathered and tanned, his hair like a tangled mess of hempen string. And they'd shake their heads and murmur, "There goes the madman." But he didn't mind. Mad or not, he had his purpose. When he reached the chapel, he would stretch out on the worn flagstones, the rough surface biting into his shoulder, and he would begin to paint. The canvas leaned against the altar, propped up on two bricks held by a nail hammered into the crumbling stone. He used the fresco technique, mixing pigment with water and small pebbles, dabbing and brushing the color onto the wall, the air thick with the scent of wet earth and lime. Slowly, bit by bit, the figures emerged from the darkness. There were saints and prophets, poets and philosophers, friends and lovers, his faces he had known and loved, and others he had only dreamed of. They floated on a sea of blue, the deep, fathomless blue of the sky above, the Arno below. But what was he doing? Why did he create these ethereal beings, these shades from another world? What need had he to bind them to the crumbling walls of this forsaken chapel? Could it be the same need that drove the young apprentice to stand before his work for hours on end, mesmerized by the play of light and shadow, the subtle gradations of color, the perfect symmetry of form? Matteo felt it stir within him, that ancient fire, the love of beauty for its own sake, the joy of creation, the sheer exuberance of life. But no, this was something else, something older, deeper. It was a longing for connection, a desire to bridge the chasm of time and space that separated him from the world, from the people he had once known and loved. In the solitude of his work, he sought solace. In the act of creation, he found meaning. And as he painted, he thought of Luca, his gifted student, now famous throughout Florence and beyond. How many noble palaces had he adorned with his frescoes? How many altars had he transformed into celestial realms? How many commissions had he completed? How many satisfied patrons had he left? And what of himself? What had become of him? The years had been hard. The wars had taken much. His wife and children, his health, his sight. But they had also given him perspective. They had stripped away all pretense, all affectation, leaving him raw and vulnerable, but also free. Free from the expectations of others, free from the need to conform, free to be himself. Now, looking out over the vineyards, bathed in the golden glow of sunset, he felt a sense of peace. He had done what he could. He had made art, that was enough. And then, one day, Luca came to see him. He found Matteo slumped over his work table, his brushes lying abandoned on the rough stone, his eyes closed, a faint smile on his lips. "Master," Luca said softly, stepping closer. "You haven't touched your paints today." Matteo opened his eyes. They were cloudy and dim, but he saw Luca. He saw the concern etched on his student's face, the question in his voice. "I'm tired, Luca," Matteo replied, his voice raspy with disuse. "I think I'm finished." "Finished?" Luca echoed, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" "I have nothing more to paint here," Matteo said, gesturing to the completed frescoes on the chapel walls. "These are my last colors, Luca." He looked at his hands, gnarled and twisted by age and toil. "My hands can mix no more." Yes. Luca came closer, his gaze sweeping over the vibrant figures on the walls, the rich tapestry of color and light and shadow. "This is your masterpiece, master," he said finally. "What do you mean?" Matteo asked. "This is your greatest work. It may be your last, but it will endure, Luca. These paintings, they will outlive us both." The old man smiled, a sad, wistful smile. "Perhaps," he murmured, "perhaps." Luca stood in silence for a long moment, contemplating the frescoes. Then he turned and walked toward the door. "Where are you going?" Matteo called after him. Luca paused. "To tell them," he said softly, "to tell them what you have done." And with that, he was gone, leaving Matteo alone in the chapel with his ghosts. As the sun dipped below the horizon, bathing the interior in hues of orange and violet, Matteo closed his eyes, savoring the silence. He could hear the distant sound of hammers and chisels now, the rhythmic thud of a loom, the lowing of cattle in the fields, the laughter of children playing in the fading light. Life went on, he thought, and in that moment, he felt content. He had given them beauty, he whispered, and that was enough. Matteo died that winter. He had been ill for months, wasting away slowly, patiently, like a candle flame in the wind. When Luca came to see him, he found him delirious, muttering incoherently about saints and sinners, light and shadow, water and wine. His paintings were all around him, framing the doorway, climbing the walls, spilling onto the ceiling. Faces stared down at him, accusingly, serenely, knowingly. He was surrounded by their gazes, their whispers, their memories. Luca stayed with him until the end, holding his hand, stroking his hair, reading to him from the poets. And when he died, it was as if a great weight lifted from the room. The paintings seemed to sigh, the shadows deepened, the silence returned. In the spring, the townspeople came to see the frescoes. They flocked to the chapel from neighboring villages, from distant cities. They marveled at the colors, the figures, the stories. They whispered in awe, pointing and murmuring. Luca stood among them, watching them, feeling their wonder, their admiration. He knew that none of it would have been possible without Matteo, the old mad painter from the hills. And as he gazed at the frescoes, he saw not only the genius of his master, but the depth of his humanity, the quiet dignity of his spirit, the fierce intensity of his passion. For in those paintings, Matteo had given them beauty. And in that, he had given them hope. The masters tell me I am obsessed with death. They say they can't talk about anything else around me but death. It is true. Death interests me. I think about it constantly. I have a friend who's dying. His name is Matteo. He is one of the best painters in the world. He is very famous. People come from all over to see his work. He has students, They sit at his feet, absorbing his wisdom. And now, he is very sick, and he will die soon. I can feel it in my bones. It's summer, and we are visiting him at his home in a village in Tuscany. It is a hilltop town. We climb up the stairs. The air grows thinner and thinner, and Matteo lives in a house made of warm stone. Hey, it feels good to be here, even if I only have a few days left with him. He stands in his garden, looking out over the valley. The land is cracked and baked by the sun. It seems so empty, yet it is so beautiful. The light is so strong. He is facing the west, the direction of the setting sun. That is where he has been painting, where he has put most of his energy. Facing the sunset, he has captured so much of the light. Now he turns and looks at me. His eyes are full of the light of the setting sun. They are the color of rust. He speaks to me in low tones, the way one speaks to someone who is far away. When he was young, he would paint in the great cathedrals. Oh, how the gold leaf would catch the light. How the cardinals would stroke their chins, pleased with themselves for being so close to God. How the rich would stand and think they could touch heaven with their fingers. He says, this wall doesn't want gold. It wants warmth without shine, memory without glory. He walks toward the wall and begins to mix colors. The light touches it and fades, even as it touches the plaster. He adds a little more of the soft yellow and a tiny pinch of burnt orange, almost nothing. This is the color of light through old linen, of the sun filtering through dust, he says. And then he begins to paint at the top of the wall with a brush so big it takes all of my strength to hold it. He pushes the color up and up and up, covering the entire surface. He works so fast and with such precision that there is no chance of copying him. I watch as the color soaks into the thirsty wall, filling it with warmth. He paints every day, and each day he creates a sunrise. I can feel the heat on my skin. When he finishes, he steps back to look at it. That is the color of morning, remembered by a dying man, he says. I see that it is not a halo. It is not divine. It is just the memory of the first light of dawn. Now he is lying in bed. He is very weak. I lean close to him, and he whispers, I don't want to die. Then he falls asleep. In the night, I hear him calling out in Latin. I go to him. His sheets are soaked in sweat. He is talking about his paintings. He asks me to take care of them. He is afraid that someone will tear them down. He is afraid that they will be forgotten. He begs me to keep his work safe, and I promise to do so. When the sun rises, I bring him breakfast. He eats very little, but he is still talking. He says that when he was young, he dreamed of painting the sunrise and the sunset, and he thought he had done it. He said, I thought I had done it. Hi. Asked me what time it was, and I told him. It is 7 a.m., he whispered. I have 3 hours. He got out of bed and walked to his easel. He stood there looking at the blank canvas for a long time. Then he began to paint furiously. When he finished, he stepped back. Think I finally did it, he said. He turned to me and smiled. Look, it is 10 o'clock already. I have only 2 more hours. He went back to his easel and looked again at the canvas. No, this is not it, he whispered. I must try again. He began to paint again. It was noon when he turned to me again. I think I did it this time, he said. He was very weak and barely conscious, but he forced himself to stand up and look at the painting. No, he whispered. I must try one last time. He fell to his knees in front of the easel. I need your help, he said to me. I can't get up. I helped him, and together we looked at the canvas. Maybe this time, he whispered. He closed his eyes and died. The wall outside is covered with paintings of sunrises. Every morning I wake up and watch the sun rise. It is always a new painting. It is never the same. Yet every morning Matteo's sunrises are the same. They are stuck forever at 7 a.m. It is strange. It is painful. It makes me cry. But there is also something beautiful about it. It is like he has given me a piece of his soul. Every sunrise he has painted is a part of him. And now he is gone. All that remains is the wall. I kneel in front of the wall and I rest my forehead against it. I can feel the warmth of the colors. They remind me of him. They remind me of life. I close my eyes and I remember the first time I saw him. He was standing in his garden, facing the west. The light was catching his hair and turning it gold. I saw the light in his eyes. They were the color of rust. I saw the way he held himself, proud and strong. I saw the way he loved the light. I knew even then that he was dying. I felt it in my bones. I could see it in the way he walked. Oh, I could see it in the set of his shoulders. I could see it in the color of his eyes. I knew that he was dying, and I was afraid. Now I understand. I understand that he wasn't afraid. He was a painter, and he painted the light until he died. He knew that one day soon I would come to visit him. And when I did, he would give me the legacy of all his sunrises. I opened my eyes. I look at the sun rising over the Tuscan hills. It is a beautiful painting, but it is not Matteo's. Today, the sky is filled with pinks and reds and oranges. The clouds are on fire. It is alive with movement. It is a celebration of light. And I know that this is the last time I will ever see it. I will never see another sunrise in this place. I will never see Matteo again. I feel the tears coming. I let them fall. Today, the wall is covered with paintings of sunrises, but today the sky is clear. There is no mist, no haze, no clouds. Today, the sun rises like a ball of fire. It leaps over the hills and climbs higher and higher in the sky. It is a blaze of glory. And I know that this is how Matteo saw it, with wonder and awe. He saw the sun as a miracle. He painted it every day, not because he understood it, but because he didn't. He wanted to capture its mystery. He wanted to hold its beauty in his hands, and for a moment, he did. For a moment, his paintings held the light of the rising sun. For a moment, he was able to capture its essence. For a moment, he was able to touch the divine. And now, the sun is climbing higher and higher in the sky. The shadows are growing shorter. The light is growing stronger. The day is beginning. And I know that Matteo is watching. I feel his presence beside me. I can hear his voice in my ear. The light touches it and fades, even as it touches the plaster. Have you ever experienced a profound sense of loss, so overwhelming that it steals your ability to speak? Your voice, which usually expresses your identity, your thoughts, your feelings, is taken away, leaving you unable to communicate or connect with others. This unsettling experience is known as aphasia, and it's something that many people go through, often as a result of a stroke. As an artist, when I discovered I had aphasia, it was like losing a part of my soul. I couldn't bring myself to create art for a long time. It felt pointless without the ability to express myself freely. However, recently, I came across an article about an extraordinary Italian artist named Matteo, who, despite suffering from aphasia, found a way to communicate and express himself through his art. His story gave me hope and inspired me to pick up my brushes once again. In this video, I'll share Matteo's incredible story and how it has affected my artistic journey. So let's delve into the depths of his talent and the challenges he overcame. The house was filled with the scent of wet plaster and old paint. In the high vaulted ceiling, a bare bulb cast sharp shadows on the dust motes dancing in the afternoon sun. Matteo carefully dipped his brush into a can of red paint and started to trace the shape of a robe. Each pigment held memory. The red had once stained the robes of a bishop. The blue traded for salt across the mountains. The brown, simple earth dug near the garden where Matteo's mother had grown thyme. He painted. These memories rose with the dust. He did not cry. He did not smile. He only layered them in silence, letting the past settle in the curve of a shoulder, the fold of a robe, the shadow behind a kneeling figure. The figures on the wall were still faceless, but they were beginning to take weight, like ghosts returning to the stone. When the paintbrush slipped from his numb fingers and clattered to the floor, Matteo looked down at the mess of colors on his hands. His own reflection stared back at him, distorted and grim. He needed to rest, but looking out over the wild tangle of the Tuscan hills, he knew he wouldn't sleep. Not tonight. Not until he'd given voice to the silent figures on the wall. He began sketching in the morning, driven by a need to fill the hollow space inside him. The walls of his farmhouse were his canvas, his paints mixed with memories. Each stroke a prayer, each shade a whispered word. Days bled into weeks, the figures slowly taking shape. Then one day, a visitor arrived. She stood in the doorway, hesitant, then stepped inside. "I heard there might be stories here," she said softly. "Can I see?" Matteo looked at her, then at the wall. He nodded mutely, his throat tight. She walked among the ghosts, reading their stories in the lines and curves of their robes, the tilt of their heads, the weight of their bodies. Finally, she stopped, her eyes fixed on a kneeling woman with her back to the viewer. Her hair was a halo of red, catching the light, her shoulders slumped under an unseen weight. "Who is she?" the woman asked, her voice barely a whisper. Matteo closed his eyes, trying to remember. A queen, maybe, or a saint. He shook his head. He didn't know, but as he watched the woman walk among the ghosts, he realized it didn't matter. They carried their stories in their postures, in the way their robes fell around them. "They have names," he mouthed, surprised by the sudden surge of sound. The woman turned, her eyes wide. "What?" Matteo tried again. "They have names." The word caught in his throat. He struggled to speak, but all that came out was a dry croak. The woman understood. She didn't need him to explain. She could see the urgency in his eyes, the desire to break free from the confines of his silent world. She spent the next few days with him, writing down the words he managed to utter, recording the stories that spilled from his lips. Together, they gave voice to the voiceless, a symphony of color and words, each stroke and syllable echoing the other. It was a cold December day in 2013 when Matteo suffered a stroke. He was just 46 years old. One moment, he was standing in the bustling Piazza della Signoria in Florence. The next, he was sprawled on the ground, the world tilted and strange around him. He couldn't speak. Fear clawed at his throat. Was he having a stroke? Hadn't he been born under the wrong astrological sign? His late grandfather had warned him about that. The doctor later confirmed it was a stroke. The kindest thing they told him was that he wouldn't get better. He returned home defeated. He couldn't speak. How could he talk about art? What use was art without words? Art that couldn't communicate anything. In despair, he threw himself into his work, covering his canvases with frantic scribbles, flinging paint against the walls, seeking an outlet for his frustration. He wanted to scream, to shatter the suffocating silence that had become his new reality. But as he painted, something unexpected happened. He entered a state of flow, a world where there were no longer words, only colors, shapes, and textures. For the first time since his stroke, he felt a semblance of peace. It was a fragile thing, easily broken, but it was enough to make him keep going. Days turned into weeks, the frenzy of his early paintings giving way to something more deliberate, more introspective. The farmhouses he'd inherited from his family became his sanctuary. Amidst the rolling hills of the Tuscan countryside, he poured his heart and soul into his work. Color by color, stroke by stroke, he built a dialogue between his inner turmoil and the beauty of the world around him. It was a testament to the power of art to transcend language, to express what words could not. His first solo exhibition, titled Climax, Aphasia, was held in 2019 in San Gimignano. Despite the provocative title, it was a celebration of resilience, a triumph over adversity. His art resonated with audiences worldwide, many of whom saw in his work a reflection of their own struggles with communication and self-expression. His paintings and sculptures became a bridge connecting him to the world once again. As Matteo continued to create, he found that his art wasn't just a means of expression, it was also a form of therapy. Through his work, he confronted his aphasia, challenging its confines and expanding its boundaries. His story is a powerful reminder of the human spirit's capacity to adapt, to overcome, and to create, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable challenges. When I first read about Matteo's story, I was deeply moved by his strength and determination. It gave me a renewed sense of hope and inspired me to see beyond my own limitations. I realized that aphasia didn't have to define me. I could still create art. It wouldn't be easy, but I was determined to try. Just like Matteo, I began to find ways to express myself through my art, experimenting with colors, shapes, and textures to convey the emotions that words could not. It's a journey that I'm still on, and it's been both challenging and rewarding. I've learned that art is a universal language that can connect us all, regardless of our differences. It's a language that speaks to the soul, bridging the gaps where words fail us. As I continue to explore this new chapter in my artistic journey, I'm grateful for the inspiration that Matteo has provided. His story has shown me that with creativity, resilience, and an unwavering spirit, we can overcome any obstacle and find our voice, even in the silence. Luca returned. This time, he stood longer. He said nothing. Matteo could feel his presence like a shift in the light, subtle but sharp. He knew what Luca saw, a half-finished fresco. No names, no saints, no grand gestures, only folds of fabric, hands without arms, a strange light that came from nowhere. It made no sense to a court painter. Luca left without speaking, but Matteo smiled to himself. Not all art must explain itself. Some paintings speak only to the wall, and sometimes the wall answers. Here's your reminder that this is a channel about art history. You can find me on social media. Today, we are looking at an enigmatic painting by Piero della Francesca, a Renaissance artist known for his flawless geometry and his unusual perspective. Why is it enigmatic? Because it makes no sense. Let's look closer. In 1452, the monks of the monastery of San Marco in Florence hired Piero to paint an altarpiece with the Virgin and Child with 4 saints. That's pretty standard. Post-altarpiece commissions specified 4 saints, 2 on the sides and 2 below the Virgin, which would have been the most logical solution for Piero too. Problem was, he didn't deliver that. Instead, we see just 2 figures on the sides. No one knows why. The panel had already been completed when the monks noticed that the commission wasn't fulfilled. They demanded a refund and sent their official representative, Monk Luca, to retrieve it. What did they get instead of the altarpiece? This painting, the ones that I opened with. So here we are, standing in front of it today. What do we see? To begin with, we see a lot of things that we don't understand. We can't read anything. There are no legible letters or numbers. There are no titles or credits. Even the subject remains ambiguous. Is this really a Virgin and Child with 2 saints? Or maybe it's just a group of 4 women. Are these 4 donors or holy figures? And if they are holy, who are they supposed to be? We know very little about the artist's life, so we're not even sure whether he put himself in there somewhere. For once, the absence of artist signatures works against us, because even scientists could unuse their fancy equipment to figure out who asked who. So let's start with what we do know. We know that the panel was meant to be an altarpiece, which is a type of painting that was placed on top of an altar to serve a religious function. Altarpiece commissions were usually pretty wealthy, which explains the unusually large size of the panel, 280 by 195 centimeters. It's big. KC commissions were also very common and therefore highly competitive. Many Renaissance artists specialize in them. And for them, the work was all about satisfying the client's needs. Altarpieces, by definition, had to represent Christian subjects. And finally, this panel was painted in 1475. That's not much to go on, but everything else is speculation. So, let's go over the most popular theories. The first theory is that the painting depicts Mary with 4 evangelists. If you think that sounds crazy, then just remember that many patrons commissioned exactly that subject. The problem is that we don't see any objects that would indicate a literary association. No books, no scrolls, no tablets. The only thing that looks remotely like a book is this weird, squiggly thing that John is holding, which looks more like a bunch of grapes. Also, if you think that John looks like a man, well, then you're not mistaken. In art history, the male evangelists are John, Matthew, and Andrew. The female evangelists are traditionally Mark, Luke, and Mary Magdalene. So yeah, John is traditionally depicted as a male, while Mark is typically female, okay? The point is, we have no idea what's going on here. Now, perhaps you've noticed that the virgin and child are outside of the main group. This detail alone has generated lots of theories, such as that this piece actually depicts a coronation. In this case, the virgin could be receiving the child Jesus, who might be King of Kings. Maybe the child Jesus being crowned is a frequent subject. Hey, and while there aren't any other regalia or symbols of power, the child's halo might suffice. We also know that the Medici family liked coronation scenes, so it's possible that they requested that. But that brings up another issue. Where are the attendants? Court painter Matteo would have known how these scenes worked. There should be people helping out, holding the canopy, holding the crown, and presenting gifts. And instead, we see this creepy woman who seems to be shoving something into the baby's face. No thanks, I'm good. Honestly, this is just one of those theories that sound plausible until you start paying attention to details. Theory, no. 3 is my favorite, and is based on the assumption that these are not important women at all. They're just random women. And yes, I know that sounds boring, but hear me out. There are no halos, so we know that they're not saints. They're not standing in prayer, so they're not praying maidens. And given the lack of decorum, they're probably not ladies in waiting either. Instead, they seem ordinary, middle-class women. We see that in their casual poses, their loose clothing, and their down-earth demeanor. I love the one in the foreground, who's chewing on a grape. She's looking directly at us, and she doesn't care. Not only is this woman peasant-like in appearance, but her hand gestures, posture, and facial expressions seem very natural. She's possibly the only person in the entire fresco who isn't frozen in an archaic pose. So, if we take this seriously, then we need to consider the possibility that Pierrot created a completely secular piece. It would be unprecedented. Chiro's other works show clear evidence of piety. So, why would he make a painting with absolutely no connection to religion? Well, maybe it was a test. In 1478, Pope Sixtus IV launched a campaign to clean up Italian painting. His goal was to stop painters from depicting beautiful women, because he thought that it encouraged lust and sin. I can't imagine a better way to pass the censor's test than with this painting. I mean, what does it encourage? Lust? Sin? Whoring? It's the most chaste painting ever. Now, this isn't a far-fetched theory. We know that contemporaries linked beautiful women to paganism. So, the argument could go that beautiful women are a distraction from the message of Christianity. Removing them would lead to more moral paintings. And we do see similar scenes in Pierrot's other works. For example, in the Baptism of Christ, we see a similar cropping of figures. Pierrot cut off the heads of 2 angels to fit them onto the panel. So he clearly wanted to keep the focus on the central figures. Another detail that strengthens this hypothesis is the fact that none of the women is young. Admittedly, that doesn't sound very titillating. But again, if you want to make a scandalously immoral painting, then you wouldn't include virgins. You would include prostitutes. The point is that there is no answer that satisfies every detail of the painting, but some come close. At least Piero della Francesca left us a note saying that he painted this panel. There are things Matteo could never paint. Not because he lacked the skill. He was considered the best fresco painter in all of Florence, maybe even all of Italy. But There were feelings he couldn't translate to the wall, colors that didn't exist for emotions he wanted to capture. How do you paint regret that doesn't ache, or longing that never asked to be returned? These were the questions that tormented him. He stared at his latest work, a portrait of a young woman with hair like spun gold and eyes that seemed to hold the secrets of the universe. She wasn't real, not as far as he knew. Yet, when he looked into her painted gaze, he saw a reflection of himself, of every secret he buried deep within his soul. He saw the tangled mess of emotions he couldn't bring himself to confront, let alone paint. In another corner of the studio, an angel remained stuck halfway up a wall, frozen in mid-flight. Its wings, once symbols of hope and faith, now mocked him with their inability to carry it to its destination. This, too, was a part of him, the abandoned dreams that followed him like a shadow, always present, never leaving him in peace. Matteo sighed and pushed away from the wall. He ran a hand through his already messy hair, feeling the weight of each passing day pressing him down like a stone in his chest. What use was he if he couldn't make sense of the chaos within him? His art was supposed to be his salvation, the way he made sense of the world, of his emotions. But now it seemed his paintings were nothing but empty gestures. Beautiful, yes, but devoid of meaning. He glanced at the unfinished fresco on the other side of the room. It was supposed to be a biblical scene, a moment of triumph and joy, but somehow it had taken on a life of its own. The figures were distorted, their expressions twisted into something that resembled pain rather than ecstasy. The vibrant colors he'd chosen seemed dull and lifeless, failing to capture the energy and emotion of the moment. And then there was the woman. She stood alone in the corner, no face, no name, just the outline of waiting. He'd been working on this piece for weeks, trying to find the right colors, the right emotions to express, but he was stuck. There were some stories he just couldn't tell, some feelings he couldn't paint. He picked up his brush and walked over to the easel. The painting was done, or rather, it was finished, but it wasn't complete. There was something missing, a final touch that would tie everything together. He stared at it for a long moment, trying to figure out what it was. Then he finally saw it. The woman in the corner needed a final stroke, a single line that would give her form, that would turn her from a symbol of waiting into a representation of something more. He dipped his brush into a can of gray. It wasn't black, wasn't white. Matteo, it was the color of forgetting. He closed his eyes, and with a steady hand, he traced a line around the woman, defining her shape, giving her a sense of presence without ever revealing her features. When he opened his eyes, he saw that the painting was complete. It wasn't perfect, but it was finished. The colors seemed to pop more now. The figures seemed to move with more grace. And the overall effect was one of melancholy beauty. It was a feeling he hadn't been able to capture before, but now it was there, tangible, real. He felt a sense of peace settle over him, a feeling of completion that he hadn't felt in weeks. He stepped back to admire his work, and in doing so, he saw more than just a painting. He saw a reflection of himself, of his journey, of his pain. In the woman's quiet dignity, he saw his own struggle to come to terms with his past. And in the gray outline that defined her, he saw the beauty in imperfection, the power of simplicity. He knew that this painting would hang in some wealthy merchant's home, admired by many, understood by none, but it didn't matter. He'd poured his heart and soul into it, and that was all that mattered. As he turned away from the painting, he felt a sense of calm wash over him. It was the feeling of having come home after a long journey, of having found a place where he belonged. It wasn't a feeling he could paint, but it was a feeling he could live, a feeling he could cherish. For the first time in a long time, he smiled. It was a sad smile, tinged with regret and longing, but it was a smile nonetheless. And in that moment, he knew he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He returned to his angel, its wings still frozen in mid-flight. This time, instead of despair, he saw hope. The hope that maybe, just maybe, he could learn to fly again. He picked up his brush, dipped it into a fresh can of paint, and began to fill in the wings. They weren't perfect, but they were a start, and that was all that mattered. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across his studio, Matteo continued to work. Kea, the unfinished frescoes on the walls, the abandoned canvases on the floor, they were all a part of him. They were his story, his pain, his hope. A teen, he wouldn't trade them for the world. Teen didn't know what the future held, whether he'd ever be able to escape the tangled mess of emotions that haunted him. But he did know that he wasn't alone. He's got his art, his story, and the courage to keep moving forward, one brushstroke at a time. His paintings might not have all the answers, but they did have a story to tell. It's a story of a man who was lost but not broken, a man who was searching for his way back to the light. And as Matteo worked, he felt a sense of purpose settle over him. He didn't know what the end of the story would be, but he was determined to live it, to feel it, and to paint it, because that was what made him Matteo, the greatest fresco painter in all of Florence, maybe even all of Italy. The day began like any other. A rooster crowed somewhere nearby. In the distance, a dog barked twice, and then there was silence. This happened every morning. The quiet was the first note in the composition of the day. Matteo knew exactly what to do. He didn't need a clock to tell him it was time to start, because the gray light that seeped through the cracks in the shutters was enough to cue the beginning of his routine. First, he would arrive at the workshop, the smell of sawdust and wet plaster still clinging to the air from the day before. Then he would take his place at the easel. And finally, he would sit quietly. In this moment, before he did anything, before he mixed any colors or made any lines appear on the plaster, Matteo felt a profound sense of calm settle over him. It was as if the world around him faded away, and all that mattered was this quiet space and the gentle play of light and shadow. And then he started to paint. His brush moved with a confidence born from years of practice. Each stroke was deliberate, each curve and angle carefully considered. As he worked, the image on the plaster took shape. It was a scene from a biblical story, one that had been handed down to him by his father and his grandfather before him. But this wasn't a work for the church. There were no grand pronouncements here, no religious fervor. This was Matteo's interpretation, his own personal vision of the story. His paintings were not meant to instruct or persuade. They were meant to inspire awe, wonder, maybe even a bit of introspection. As he worked, the colors he chose seemed to resonate with the mood he wanted to evoke. Deep blues and purples gave way to fiery reds and yellows, all set against a backdrop of rough, uneven plaster. The contrast was striking, yet somehow it worked. The textures and colors wove together to create a rich, layered tapestry that drew the viewer into the scene. Matteo didn't think about what the painting would be called. Its names were for the priests, the preachers, the people who would hang his works in their grand halls. Matteo only had the image and the feelings that came with it. Now, some might think this was an odd existence, this life of solitude and routine. For Matteo, it was perfect. He liked the solitude. It allowed him to focus on his art without distractions. And the routine soothed him. It gave him a sense of stability and purpose in a world that often felt chaotic and unpredictable. The sun climbed higher in the sky. Light streamed through the window, illuminating motes of dust that danced in its beam. Time passed, marked not by the hands on the clock, but by the subtle shift in the quality of the light. A carnal change in the intensity of the colors. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it was over. The quiet returned, deeper now, richer, more resonant. Matteo stood back to admire his work. The painting was done. He stepped away from it, letting his eyes adjust to the dimmer light. It was then that he noticed a young girl standing in the doorway. She was watching him with wide, curious eyes. Matteo smiled. He knew exactly what she was thinking. she had seen him arrive. Teen, she had watched him paint. Teen, and now she wanted to know what he had created. But Matteo shook his head. He didn't want to show her. Not yet. Not until the priest came to collect the painting and take it to the church, where it would eventually be hung in a place of honor. Only then would the world outside this little workshop know that he had been here. When the girl saw that he didn't want to show her, she didn't push. Instead, she tilted her head and smiled. Then she ran off, her laughter echoing in the now silent room. And Matteo was left alone again, savoring the quiet, the peace, the solitude. He knew that tomorrow the routine would start again. The rooster would crow, the dog would bark, and he would sit down to paint. And while a part of him looked forward to it, another part knew that something was missing. Over the years, many young girls had come to watch him paint, drawn by the magic of seeing an artist at work, intrigued by the stories they'd heard about the man who painted pictures that seemed to come alive. But today was different. Today, the girl stayed longer. She didn't run off after he told her he didn't want to show her the painting. She stayed in the doorway, watching him pack up his things, her eyes never leaving his face. When he finally looked up from his work and saw her still standing there, he couldn't help but smile. "Can I see, please?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Matteo hesitated. Usually, he didn't allow anyone to see his work in progress. It was his sanctuary, his private space. But there was something about this girl, her curiosity, her wonder, that disarmed him. So he nodded and stepped aside, allowing her to enter the workshop. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The girl stood there, taking in the sight before her, the half-packed easel, the paints, the brushes, the unfinished painting on the wall. Then she walked towards the painting. As she did, Matteo watched her closely, gauging her reaction. When she stopped in front of it and let out a soft gasp, he knew he'd made the right decision. "It's beautiful," she whispered, reaching out to touch the canvas, but stopping herself just short of actually doing it. Matteo nodded. He was glad she liked it. It came, but he knew that this moment wouldn't last. Soon, the priest would arrive and take the painting with him, and she would forget all about it. Still, he allowed himself to bask in her admiration, if only for a little while longer. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the workshop floor. The quiet was broken only by the sound of their voices as Matteo talked about his work, the colors, the techniques, the inspiration behind the piece. The girl listened intently, hanging on his every word. Matteo could tell she was already planning what questions to ask next. He smiled. It was nice to have someone to talk to, even if it was just for a little while. Soon, though, the conversation turned to the painting itself, to the story it depicted and the emotions it evoked. Matteo saw a flicker of understanding cross the girl's face, and he knew that she was getting something out of this experience, something more than just the spectacle of watching an artist at work. He saw in her a reflection of himself, the young artist, eager to learn, eager to understand the world through the lens of his craft. For a moment, Matteo forgot that he was talking to a child. He saw instead a kindred spirit, a fellow traveler on the journey of discovery. They talked until the light began to fade, until the shadows stretched and deepened. When the girl finally had to leave, she promised to return tomorrow, and Matteo knew that she would. He saw in her a dedication, a passion for art that mirrored his own. He watched her go, a small smile playing on his lips. The quiet returned to the workshop, but it was a different kind of quiet now. It was the quiet of anticipation, of creativity, of potential. Matteo knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to create, to inspire. And he welcomed it all. The solitude, the routine, the endless possibilities that lay before him. As he settled in for the night, the image of the girl lingered in his mind. He thought about her questions, her observations, her enthusiasm. He realized that his art, his craft, was more than just a means of making a living. It was a way of connecting with others, of sharing his vision of the world. And it didn't matter whether his audience was a priest, a wealthy patron, or just a curious young girl. What mattered was that he had something to offer, something that brought him joy, and, in turn, brought joy to those who saw his work. He closed his eyes, the image of the girl's smiling face imprinted on his mind. He slept with a sense of contentment, knowing that tomorrow would bring a new canvas, a new story, a new opportunity to share his gift with the world. One evening, he stepped back. He had not realized how far it had come. Figures leaned into each other. Hands met in quiet gestures. Path curved through the center, vanishing into faded light. He had not planned the path, or the way the cloth draped over one figure's lap, or how the shadows bent like falling leaves. But the wall had done it. The painting had begun to speak for itself, not in words, not in meaning, but in weight. It no longer asked him what came next. It simply waited to be finished. And Matteo, for the first time in weeks, felt tired. It was the kind of tiredness that came from something deep within his bones, something that ached with a dull, persistent pain. This painting had been his life for months now, consuming all his waking hours and bleeding into his dreams. When he slept, he dreamed of angels, their faces obscured by halos. Their limbs contorted in unnatural ways, impossibly thin and impossibly tall. In these dreams, they would gather around him, these angels, and point to the painting, their silent accusations echoing in his ears. "Wake up," they seemed to say. "Wake up, you have work to do." And he would wake up, his heart pounding, and immediately get to work. Trying to outrun the dream, trying to outrun the angel with the paintbrush. In the daytime, the wall was his only solace. At least here, he could ignore the accusing eyes. At least here, he could lose himself in the figures that populated this world that he was creating. He had started the piece right after the funeral. Grief had pushed him to it, compelled him to take up the brush. It had been an impulse, a desperate attempt to make sense of the senseless. But then something strange had happened. As he painted, a calmness had settled over him, a numbness that dulled the pain just enough so that he could keep going. The canvas had become his anchor, keeping him tethered to reality while everything inside him threatened to slip away. The priest had told him to let go, to release her to God. But how could he let go when all he saw were the closed casket, the empty room where she used to be? How could he release her when he hadn't said goodbye? He was an artist, the priest had said, and she had been an art. He should celebrate the fact that he had been able to capture her likeness on canvas, to hold her image in his hands long after she was gone. But Matteo had not celebrated. He had been terrified. Terrified of the blank canvas, terrified of the thought of ever having to paint her again. He had shoved the painting into a drawer and locked it away, ignoring the insistent tapping of the wall until finally, one day, he had opened the drawer and the painting had stared back at him. It had taken him 3 days to finish it. 3 days of tears and tantrums and the constant nagging feeling that he was betraying her by putting brush to canvas. But it had helped. It had let him feel something other than numb. He remembered showing it to the priest. Father Anselmo had looked at it and sighed. "She is beautiful," he had said, "but the light, Matteo, it's too bright. You have captured her beauty, but you cannot show the darkness that surrounds it. You cannot show the grief." And the priest had been right. That was why he had started again. To show the darkness, to embrace the grief. And so he had put the second painting away, too, when it was done, unable to bear the sight of it, unable to bear the emotion it evoked. But both paintings had called to him. They had beckoned from their hiding places, reminding him that they were there, waiting to be finished. So he had pulled them out, placed them side by side, and started the third one. This time, he had decided he would not hide from the darkness. He would let it consume him. And in letting it consume him, he had found peace. Well, almost peace. Now, looking at the almost finished painting, he could see the darkness. He could see how the stark Black branches clawed at the sky, mirroring the agony in his soul. He could see how the wind snatched at the dead leaves, just as it was snatching at his sanity. But there was something else in the painting, too. Something that surprised him. It was not the way he had imagined this scene. He had envisioned a barren tree, bare branches silhouetted against a gray sky. But somehow, in spite of the season, the tree was laden with ripe, heavy fruit. The figs were glossy and dark, the leaves a vibrant green, the vines thick and alive. He had not planned this. He did not know how it had happened, yet, as he stepped back to admire it, he realized that without those figs, without that burst of unexpected life, the painting would be incomplete. His wife would not have liked it. She had always insisted on the importance of light, even in the darkest of times. "There is always light, Matteo," she would say. "Even when you cannot see it, you must trust that it is there." And he had shown her that light in the painting. He had shown it in the delicate fingers that reached out, brushing away the shadows, in the gentle curve of the leaning figure, in the soft, downy peach fuzz on bare arms. He had even managed to find it in the wind, in the way it ruffled the woman's dress, in the way it rustled the dead leaves, in the way it made the branches sway. He had shown the light, but he had also shown the darkness, in the hollow eyes, in the skeletal branches, in the withered hands, in the gnarled, twisted roots that clawed at the earth. When he stepped back and saw it all together, he felt a strange sense of completeness. He had embraced the darkness and still found room for the light. He had given voice to the grief and still managed to find a measure of hope. He had found balance. Looking at the painting, he could see himself in it too. It was in the hesitant brushstrokes, in the layers of color, in the cracks and crevices that revealed the canvas beneath. He had poured everything into it, his fear, his anger, his confusion, his love. He had bared his soul and laid it bare on the canvas. And now he was ready to finish it. Now he knew what came next. The silence was no longer deafening. It was comforting. The solitude was no longer suffocating. It was peaceful. He no longer felt the need to fill the silence with words or with sound. He just sat there, letting the quiet settle around him, letting it envelop him like a warm blanket. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and began to paint. He had not realized how far it had come. Figures leaned into each other. Hands met in quiet gestures. A path curved through the center, vanishing into faded light. He had not planned the path, or the way the cloth draped over one figure's lap, or how the shadows bent like falling leaves, but the wall had done it. The painting had begun to speak for itself, not in words, not in meaning, but in weight. It no longer asked him what came next. It simply waited to be finished. And Matteo, for the first time in weeks, felt tired. As the first rays of sunlight touched the horizon, he stood back, shielding his eyes from the glare. It was done. The painting was finished. Standing before it, he felt a sense of closure, a feeling that he had not thought possible since his wife's passing. It was as if the painting had absorbed his grief, distilled it, transformed it into something beautiful, something that could be shared. He looked at the figures now, bathed in the golden light of dawn, and saw not just the darkness, but the hope. He saw not just the pain, but the healing. He saw not just the loss, but the love. In the end, it had not been about capturing her image, about holding on to the memory of a lost love. It had been about letting go, about embracing the pain and finding the light. As he stepped back, he noticed something that made him smile. In the upper corner, almost hidden in the folds of the painting, was a tiny splash of white. It was the reflection of the rising sun, a reminder of the new day, a symbol of the promise to keep going, to keep living. It was a small detail, almost insignificant, but it was there. He had not painted it intentionally, but now that he saw it, he knew that it was perfect. Just like the painting, life was full of darkness and light, pain and healing, loss and love. It was about finding the balance between them, embracing the darkness and still seeking the light. He looked at the painting one last time, his wife's final painting, and then he stepped back. He needed rest now. He had given voice to the voiceless, and in doing so, he had found his own. The little hammer strikes rang out sharp and clear across the vastness of the Sistine Chapel, each one a tiny hammer blow to the artist's heart. It was 1535, and Matteo had been painting the ceiling of the chapel for 8 years. 8 years of standing on the rickety scaffold, painting, scraping, chiseling, washing in, washing out, sleeping under the stare of God Almighty. That is, when he wasn't sleeping with the women who prostituted themselves along the Tiber. Now, his shoulders slumped more with each passing day, hunched over his work like an old man. His hand trembled ever so slightly as it reached up for another dab of paint, but then steadied as he remembered the brace strapped to the end of his brush. That would do until the very end. He was getting too old for this. There were mornings when he could not make himself climb the steps to the platform. The thought of lying down for a good long nap seemed far more appealing than staring up at the face of Christ for yet another day. His studio down below was filled with half-finished paintings and sculpture, works he had abandoned in favor of the chapel. Now it seemed as if he were abandoning it again. But the chapel would have none of that. The vast expanse of ceiling, all those prophets and sibyls, they needed him. Some nights he dreamed he floated up into the air and joined them. He woke with a start, gasping for breath, his dreams an escape from the life force, squeezing the joy right out of him, up here in this God-forsaken place. Every morning he tested himself, wondering if he still had it. The ache in his wrist soon told him the answer. No, he didn't. Anymore. The fresco was proving stronger than him. The pain came sooner, lasted longer. The cold seeped deeper into his bones. His breath caught in his chest, rattled in his throat. The steps to the chapel seemed to lengthen with every sunrise. The chill in the stone bit deeper with every passing day. And still, he went back. The wall was vast, endless. There were so many figures to complete, so much detail to add. He'd been so ambitious. Michelangelo, the name boomed across Italy and beyond, rivaling the fame of Rome's own Raphael. This ceiling, this Last Judgment, it was to be his greatest masterpiece. He dipped his brush into the crimson lake, his arm shaking so slightly it almost seemed like the tremor in the water was in his mind alone. The colors were almost done, only a few touches now to bring the damned and the saved, the proud and the humble, the wrathful and the resigned, to bring them all to life. His eyes dropped to the completed section of the ceiling. How many were there? Was he finished with the first group of the elect? He squinted, trying to focus. The vision swimming before him blurred the figures together, made them seem like they swam beneath the surface of the water. A wave of dizziness swept through him. He pressed his forehead against a cool stone, willing himself to steady. Along with this tech, would he finish the work? Would he even live that long? He could not answer, but something inside him screamed, "Finish it! Finish it!" So he did. He went back to work every day. It was spring now, 1536. Raphael was dead. Michelangelo stayed in his room for 2 days, refusing food, thinking about the friend he never quite liked, the rival whose fate had mirrored his own, whose genius had burned away too brightly and too fast, leaving him alone. Now the others were gone too, Perugino and Sebastiano del Piombo. They had finished their parts of the Last Judgment. Only he remained. But then, when he was ready, he climbed the steps to the chapel and began to work. In his head, he was no longer on earth, but floating among the saints, the Blessed Virgin hovering beside him, welcoming him home. He was young again, strong, and his brush glided over the plaster, sure and steady. The pain was gone. The dizziness lifted. All that was left was the joy of creation. When he lowered himself to the ground again, he was no longer afraid of death. In fact, he looked forward to it. He knew his time was short. He could feel it in his bones, in the tremors of his hands, in the tightness in his chest. But while he had time, while the fire of creation still burned within him, he painted. He painted the saved and the damned. He painted sibyls and prophets. He painted Adam and Eve, God the Father, the Virgin Mary, Jesus Christ, the Savior of mankind. It was summer now, the year 1536. The men working on St. Peter's were stripping the scaffolding away from the dome. Already the huge expanse of sky was visible. Soon the whole world would see the glories of Michelangelo's David from atop the dome. Matteo stood back from his work, looking up at the ceiling. He could not see everything. Not anymore. Too much of the ceiling was lost to shadow. He strained to see what he had painted, what he was to paint, and then shrugged, letting the darkness veil his vision. He was too old for this. The painter was dying. The fresco would live on. He continued to go to the chapel every day. He put on his smock and his hose and climbed the stairs to the platform. But he did not bring paint with him. He brought chalk instead, to trace the outlines of the figures that swam in his head. The ones he saw when he dreamed he floated above the clouds. With chalk, he traced the forms of the saved and the damned. Then, with wash, he gave them color, flesh tones, and robes, and wings, faces pale and serene, or twisted in torment, all swimming in shades of red and blue and gold and green. He worked quickly now, eager to finish, eager to join his friends and his rivals in the next life. As the weeks passed, he painted less and less. A fold of cloth here, a single leaf there, a tiny sliver of goldless light in a figure's eye. Okay? The others continued to work, ignoring him. Sometimes he saw them glance his way, saw them talking in hushed tones about the old man who sat in the chapel, who walked the streets of Rome wrapped in his heavy cloak, shielding his thin body from the sun and the wind, who haunted the taverns where young artists gathered, listened to their dreams, nodded his ancient head, and then bought them wine. And sometimes they found him in the Sistine Chapel tracing lines in the dust with the tip of his finger, muttering prayers in the darkness, waiting for the light to return to his eyes, the light that the fresco stole from him. Then the fresco glowed in the daylight, a blaze of color against the dark ceiling. Crowds came to see it, gasped at the brilliance of the Last Judgment. They pointed and whispered. Few noticed the faintest trace of white against the brick wall, the shape of a man, old and bent, asleep in the shadow of God. By November, the scaffolding was gone. The last traces of it fell away, allowing the entire ceiling to come into view. All of Rome could now see the Last Judgment. Matteo did not watch the unveiling. He could not. He was blind. It seen enough light. He was ready for the darkness, okay? He lay in his bed, stark naked, save for the crucifix hanging around his neck. His breathing was shallow. His lips barely moved as he whispered prayers, begging forgiveness for the sins he had committed, for the lives he had taken, for the souls he had damned. As his sight faded, he saw the Virgin Mary, smiling at him, beckoning with a finger. Wanted to reach out to her, to tell her he was coming, but he couldn't move. He could not speak. He was too weak. So he watched as she floated up into the air, up toward the light, and then she was gone. He struggled to breathe. He could feel himself slipping away, drifting upward. At last, he closed his eyes, feeling the darkness welcome him home. The hammer blows echoed through the chapel as the blind old painter slipped into the arms of God, unaware that his greatest work was now on display for all the world to see, unaware that the Last Judgment had been completed. In the beginning, there were no rules. The canvas, it was just waiting, a white field in an endless blue. But then Matteo arrived, and with him, a splash of crimson, the first note of color in that vast emptiness. He dipped his brush into the red liquid, swirling it around like a conductor's baton, orchestrating a symphony of strokes across the canvas, each move precise, intentional part of a composition born from his mind's eye, something he saw and we couldn't. Days turned into weeks. The splashes of color became layers, building, evolving, becoming a dialogue between Matteo and the canvas, a conversation in hues and shades. Sometimes he would stand back, lost in thought, tracing lines in the air with his finger. Then he would resume his dance, moving with a grace that belied the precision of his movements. He coaxed, he persuaded, he commanded the colors to sing their song, watched in awe, a silent audience to this private performance. Wanted to understand, to decipher the language of his art, but it was a mystery written in a code we couldn't crack. What was he trying to tell us? What story was he painting for us? Or was it a story without words, a poem without a voice? Then came the days when Matteo would arrive carrying water. In those days, the colors danced differently. They flowed, they merged, they sang a different tune, one that spoke of movement, of life, of change. He would add a dash of blue here, a touch of green there, and suddenly the painting would come alive. It was as if he was infusing the colors with the very essence of the sky, the leaves, the depths of the ocean. One day, he brought a new toy, a square box filled with tubes, each holding a universe of color. At first, we couldn't see the difference. All we saw was the addition of new hues to the palette, more colors dancing in the symphony. But slowly, subtly, the painting began to shift. The blues took on a deeper tone, the reds a softer edge, the greens turned sharper, the yellows brighter. It was as if the arrival of these new colors had stripped away the old, making them seem muted, less vibrant. As the weeks went by, Matteo kept bringing new colors, expanding the palette, enriching the tapestry. But with each addition, the initial colors seemed to fade, to recede into the background. It was a slow fade, not a sudden eclipse, but a gradual shift that made us wonder, was the painting changing, or were we? Was our perception shifting, our eyes growing accustomed to the brilliance of Matteo's art? The question lingered. Were we becoming blind to the beauty of the early days, unable to appreciate the brilliance of the start, because we were too busy marveling at the ever-changing spectacle? Then there were days when Matteo would arrive with brushes, not just any brushes, but ones with feathers, soft and gentle, perfect for creating clouds. On those days, the feather brushes would dance across the canvas, leaving behind wisps of white, light strokes that seemed to float on the canvas, mimicking the movement of the wind. With each stroke, the painting grew richer, more textured, more alive. But with the addition of the clouds, the initial burst of colors seemed even more distant. The reds and blues and greens now buried under layers of white, their vibrancy dulled by the soft, ethereal brushstrokes. The painting, it seemed, was becoming a different work, something more serene, more atmospheric. And we found ourselves at a crossroads, torn between the vibrancy of the beginning and the serenity of the clouds, wondering which Matteo was the real Matteo, the artist who painted with passion and fury, or the one who created ethereal cloudscapes, featherlight and infinitely subtle. As the weeks turned into months, we noticed something unsettling. The painting, it was nearing completion, but Matteo never signed it. He never inscribed his name or even left a mark, a symbol or an initial. It was as if he was afraid to sully the canvas with his presence, to mar the perfection of the work with the permanence of his signature. It puzzled us. Was he afraid of criticism? Did he fear that his name would somehow diminish the impact of his art? Or was he hoping that the painting would speak for itself, that its brilliance would outshine any need for attribution? Each day we watched, waited for the final flourish, the stroke that would complete the work, the one that would serve as both ending and signature. But it never came. Matteo worked tirelessly, adding the finishing touches, but he never put his stamp on the work, never left his mark. And then there were the days when Matteo brought nothing new, no pigment, no water, no brushes. He would sit and look. Then he would reach for a small cloth, a simple piece of fabric, mundane, ordinary. And with one finger, he would smudge the edge of a shape, a quiet gesture, more felt than seen. He would stand and walk to the far corner and touch the stone, run his fingers along the rough surface, as if seeking purchase, as if testing the strength of the wall. And then he would press his thumb gently to the wall. No paint, no mark, just contact. It was a strange ritual, one that defied logic. It made no sense in the context of his art. Why would he bring nothing and spend his time in this strange communion with the unfinished painting and the unyielding stone? There were times when we wondered if Matteo was losing his grip on reality, if the pressures of creation were taking their toll on his sanity. Was he losing himself in the labyrinth of his own art? Had the quest for perfection driven him to the brink of madness? Or was there more to these rituals? A deeper meaning hidden beneath the surface, a secret code known only to Matteo and his art. And then, on the final day, Matteo brought nothing. No pigment, no water, no brushes. He sat and looked. Then he reached for a small cloth. With one finger, he smudged the edge of a shape. Quiet gesture, more felt than seen. He stood, walked to the far corner, touched the stone. There, he pressed his thumb gently to the wall. No paint, no mark. Contact. His signature was not a name, not even a mark. It was the choice to leave the painting finished without saying so. Luca entered the chapel the next morning. The air was still cold. The brushes were neatly folded, the pigment bowls dry. He stepped slowly, not wanting to disturb the silence. The fresco covered the wall now, complete yet soft. There was no central figure, no miracle, no scene from scripture, just human forms, waiting, touching, fading. Luca stood for a long time. He looked for a name. There was none, but he knew. He knew the hand behind it. He saw the silence and the colors. He felt the weight of something more permanent than memory. The wall did not shine, but it glowed. The first light of dawn had barely begun to paint the sky with pinks and oranges when he arrived. As always, the crisp air bit at his lungs, but the pain was a welcome distraction from the turmoil within him. His breaths formed white puffs that danced and dissipated into the vastness. Around him, the vineyard slept, their gnarled branches reaching out like supplicating arms towards the nascent sun. The sight both calmed and troubled him. For what was he doing here? Why had he come back? Hadn't he made his decision? He remembered the urgency in his own voice, the finality of his words. I will never paint another inch of wall for you. How many times had he uttered those words? Decades, it seemed. And yet, here he was, drawn back to this place like a moth to a flame, to the very fresco he had sworn to abandon. He pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The air was stale, devoid of the comforting scent of incense that usually permeated every corner of the chapel. Dust motes danced in the pale light, filtering through the high windows, illuminating the vast expanse of the wall where once he had labored with brush and pigment. Now there was nothing, just bare stone. No trace of the figures that had sprung to life under his hand. No echoes of the vibrant colors he had mixed with such care. Quet, a glint of gold amidst the shadows. A discarded paintbrush lay on the cold stone floor, its bristles pointing accusingly toward the wall. Luca felt a pang of guilt. Was this some cruel jest? Had someone else come to mock him, to remind him of his failure? He approached the brush, his heart pounding. It was one of his brushes, his own, the one he had used to make the final mark, the definitive stroke that had sealed his defiance, his abandonment of the work, of the chapel, of everything. He picked it up gingerly, as if afraid of being pricked by its memory. The bristles were stiff with dried pigment, the wood of the handle smooth and worn from countless hours of use. He closed his eyes, inhaling deeply, trying to quell the turmoil within him, and in that moment, he heard it. A whisper, soft yet insistent, carried on the breath of the wind. Luca, it said, and the sound resonated deep within his soul. It was the chapel calling to him, reaching out across the chasm of his betrayal, beseeching him to return, to finish what he had started. His resolve crumbled like aging plaster, revealing the raw determination that had been his foundation all those years ago when he first set brush to stone. He felt a sudden rush of clarity, a resurgence of purpose that belied his advanced age. This was not merely a whim. This was not a capricious urge to paint. This was the rekindling of a lifelong passion, a commitment that transcended mere artistic expression. It was a vow he had made to himself, to his craft, and to the very essence of his being. In that instant, he knew he would not resist the call. With newfound vigor, he turned toward the wall, toward the silent plea etched in stone. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and touched the cold surface. It was rough, unforgiving, yet beneath his fingertips, he could feel the latent potential, the promise of color waiting to be coaxed forth. He closed his eyes, savoring the moment, the years melting away until all that remained was the feel of the stone, the scent of dust, and the whisper of wind through the rafters. When he opened his eyes, they were filled with a fierce determination. It was time to finish what he had started. Time to bring the figures on the wall to life, to imbue them with the vibrancy and depth that had always been their essence. Time to create not just a mural, but a testament to his enduring spirit, a celebration of life, love, and faith. He dipped his brush into the nearest bowl of pigment, a rich, deep red, the color of blood and courage, and began to paint. His strokes were confident, sure, each movement adding another layer to the tapestry of color that was slowly but surely taking shape on the wall. The figures he painted were not merely religious icons. They were symbols of the human experience, of joy and sorrow, hope and despair. They were testaments to the beauty and fragility of life itself. As he worked, the chapel seemed to hum with a quiet energy, as if the very stones were thrumming in appreciation of the artistry unfolding before them. The silence was no longer oppressive. It was companionable, encouraging. Luca lost himself in his work, oblivious to the passage of time. Hours slipped by unnoticed as he blended colors and textures, creating a symphony of form and hue. The wall became a canvas, a window into the soul of the artist. When he finally stepped back to admire his work, the first rays of sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the fresco with a golden glow. It was as if the painting itself was basking in the dawning day, rejoicing in the triumph of light over darkness. Luca gazed at his creation, his heart swelling with a mixture of pride and humility. He had poured his heart and soul into every stroke, and now it was complete. There was no central figure of Christ, no miracle, no scene from Scripture. Human forms, reaching, touching, fading, a representation of the universality of human emotions, the shared experiences that bound all people together. The faces in the fresco were soft, almost indistinct, their features blurred as if to emphasize the anonymity of their humanity. Yet their expressions were so full of life, of longing, of hope, that they seemed to leap off the wall and touch the soul. Luca had not intended to create a religious work of art. He had rebelled against the commission, rejected the confines of traditional religious iconography, and yet in doing so, he had created something truly transcendent. His masterpiece was not a mere painting. It was a testament to the power of human emotion, a celebration of the shared experiences that defined their existence. As he stood there, contemplating his creation, Luca realized that he had not merely defied the expectations of the church, he had transcended them. He had created a work of art that spoke to the deepest recesses of the human soul, a work that would resonate with anyone who beheld it, regardless of their faith or beliefs. The chapel was silent, but the message was clear. Luca's masterpiece had been born, and as the sun rose higher in the sky, bathing the chapel in golden light, Luca knew that his life's work had found its home. The figures on the wall watched over him as he left the chapel, their silent gaze a testament to the bond he had forged with them, with the very essence of human experience. The chapel was empty now, its purpose fulfilled. its message sent. Luca walked away, his steps lighter, his heart fuller. He had given the world a masterpiece, and in doing so, had found peace. The fresco shimmered in the morning light, a beacon of hope and humanity. And in the hearts of those who saw it, a new understanding dawned. The true meaning of faith lay not in blind obedience, but in the courage to follow one's heart.